Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for being with us here today. We're really happy for everybody who was able to join us today for our Native Voices in STEM seminar. Today we have Dr. Marco Hatch. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. Now, just to quickly introduce our seminar series, the Native Voices in STEM series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center, the University of Arizona, the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, the Native Fuse Alliance, and the Office of Societal Impact. This seminar series highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists, providing students with the opportunity to network and learn about the research and careers of Native leaders in various fields. Each session includes a Q&A segment at the end, where all attendees are encouraged to engage with the speaker, ask questions, and participate in the discussion. Dr. Marco Hatch, a member of the Samish Indian Nation, is an associate professor of environmental science at Western Washington University. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Washington and a Ph.D. in Biological Oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. His research focuses on integrating Indigenous knowledge with marine science, particularly in revitalizing ancestral clam gardens to support food sovereignty and coastal sustainability. Dr. Hatch leads the Coastal Communities and Ecology Lab at WWU and serves as a trustee for the Nature Conservancy in Washington. His work emphasizes the importance of Indigenous-led conservation and creating opportunities for underrepresented students in marine sciences.
Thank you, Jason. My name's Marco Hatch, and as Jason mentioned, I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation and faculty member at Western Washington University. And so, for those not familiar, we're in Bellingham, Washington. We're about an hour and a half north of Seattle, and about half an hour south of Canada, right on the I-5 corridor. And today, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work we've done in my lab around both marine ecology and then centering Indigenous people, Marin. Let's just say marine sciences, not marine sciences. It's just funny because that's my daughter's name. And some of the successes and barriers, which is why I'm talking about attempting. I think that looking at successes is important, but thinking about where we still have barriers and how to overcome those barriers. And I'm going to start with the story called the cookie story, and I'll invite you at the end of the talk to reflect on the cookie story and think about what that means in the context of partnership, and particularly in the context of partnership between communities and mainstream researchers, academic institutions. So the cookie story comes from Denise Augustine from the Staminas First Nation on Vancouver Island, and was shared to me by her daughter Sky Augustine, and is shared with you with their permission. So the cookie story starts like many great stories. The cookie story starts in the kitchen, and there's two different groups of people in the kitchen that have historically had their differences. Two different groups of people that have had failed partnerships over time and had their disagreements. And they're in the kitchen and they're thinking and talking about this and thinking about ways forward. Well, we're in the kitchen. Maybe what we can do as a way forward is make something, cook something. Well, what do we want to cook? Do we want to cook something on the stove? Do we want to make a meat dish? What do we want to do? And they discuss for quite a while. They say, well, let's bake something. What do you want to bake? And they talked about a few things. In the end, they decided what would be best is if we both went back to our home communities, shared out this idea of baking something together, gathered up ingredients that are important to us, and then came back the next day and then decided what to bake together. So both groups went back home. One group is telling their community, this is going to be different this time. This is going to be exciting. We're going to gather up things that are important to us. And so they gather a bunch of traditional plants and foods, and they come back the next day. And the second group walks in with hundreds of pre-made cookies, hundreds of beautiful symmetrical cookies. And they say, hey, just to speed the process along, we went ahead and baked the cookies, but you can decorate them. And the first group looked sad and said, well, we hoped to bake bread. And so I'll end the story there, and you can think about how that applies to our partnerships and agreements we work on, and how we co-create things between Indigenous communities and mainstream science institutions. A bit about my background. I came back to education after a few years working, doing mostly actually catering work. And I was looking for a new direction. And at that time, our chairman, Ken Hansen, had started Waswakton is his traditional name, started a internship program for Samish students to go out, live and work in the San Juan Islands, our traditional homelands, during the summer and do a variety of research in ecological restoration. And it was there I got that lens of how to view the environment. Working out in the San Juan Islands, it's an amazingly gorgeous place. And there are a lot of islands that are uninhabited today. And it's very easy to go and look at these uninhabited islands and think, oh, this is the way that they've always been, that there's not a lot of evidence of large logging or large environmental disturbances. They must have always been this way. And then through that program, I really got that lens of viewing the environment more traditionally, meaning what management practices have people done for thousands of years that shape the environment. And in our area, the environment we have now is very unnatural because of the loss of those traditional management practices. Things like burning that would fundamentally change the landscape. Things like native oysters, which are down to a few percentages of their original population. Things that are missing from the environment that it's very easy to not understand or overlook. From there, I did my doctorate down in Southern California, working on sclerochronology using clam shells as environmental indicators and applying that to archaeological materials to understand environmental change and how that related to harvest. After graduating with my doctorate, I started working at Northwest Indian College, which I'll talk about a bit more. But Northwest Indian College is on the it's the only tribal college in the Northwest. There's satellite campuses at 6 different tribal communities, and the main campus is of the Lummi Reservation near where I live now. There, I worked with a lot of students and built a research program. And then I transitioned to my current institution, Western Washington University, in 2016, where I still lead a lot of collaboration or work on a lot of collaboration with Northwest Indian College, and teach classes on Indigenous resource management and others. So Northwest Indian College is a really special spot. I was the founding director of the Salish Sea Research Center, which is this building up here. It's a 4,200 square foot research center that was funded by Obama-era American Recovery Act funds. And it's a standalone research center within the tribal college. And so the whole building, the 4,200 square foot, is all research laboratory space with a variety of technicians and students working on either individualized capstone projects or some of the larger grant-funded work. Most of my focus there was on clams and some of the clam garden work we'll talk about. And then, with that, we had a lot of students that would do research, present, and be really successful. And I think one thing that I think we all witness is that our students are very passionate about what they do, and that was often codified or acknowledged by a fair amount of student presentations and awards along with that. The image on the right here is Alex Trejo and Mariah Holiday, one student from Northwest Indian College, one from Western, that both won posters for their presentations at SACNAS a few years ago. And they worked together during the summer and presented at SACNAS. And so that was a really cool experience where we're working with students from Western and Northwest Indian College together. So one of the things that I've spent working on, going on 12 years now, working on our clam gardens or sea gardens. So the term clam garden and sea garden are used a bit interchangeably. Sea gardens has really been adopted by communities in the Southern Gulf Islands. And so I'll show a map here in a minute, but the very southern end of Vancouver Island, which actually extends south of the 49th parallel, the First Nations there have adopted the term sea gardens instead of clam gardens to acknowledge the overall role that these features play. And effectively what a clam garden or sea garden is in the ocean, the tide goes up and down every day. The bathtub goes up and down. It doesn't always go up and down the same amount every day. We have extreme low tides and extreme high tides. But within that intertidal zone where the water's going up and down, there's a very narrow band where a specific type of clam likes to live, which is the common name's butter clam. And they're sort of, I wish I had one on my desk, but they're sort of like, they get about yay big. And that's one of the primary storage, trading, and consumption clams in this area. There's a very narrow window they like to live. If they're too high, they dry out and die. If they're too low, they get eaten by sea stars. And what a clam garden is doing is basically terracing that exact narrow tidal window, terracing the beach and increasing the amount of habitat. So just like you could terrace a hill to grow more grapes, you can terrace a beach to grow more clams. And this is done by moving rocks to the low tide line and building a rock wall. And behind that rock wall, sediment fills in and it creates a plateau at the exact tidal height that clams like to live in. And below is an image of Jefferson M. from Northwest Indian College. He's a Urington Paiute. He's back home working for his community now. But he did some clam garden work with me when he was a student at Northwest Indian College. And you can see the prominent rock wall. This is at Russell Island near Salt Spring Island in the Southern Gulf Islands. Now that rock wall is part of a restoration project that's been going on now for over a decade. And that was a reconstructed, a restored, revitalized clam garden. So it's an ancestral clam garden that's probably, I don't think we have dates for this one, but the one around the corner, there's some rough dates in the 3,000 to 4,000 year old range. And over time, that rock wall had been broken up, not maintained, and this project restored that clam garden rock wall, working with about 10 different First Nations in Parks Canada. You see a really dominant, prominent wall here, but just pointing out that that's a restored feature, a revitalized feature. And one of the really cool things about clam gardens is seems like every week we're learning a lot more. In particular, we're not really sure what the entire range of clam gardens are. So there's a number of features in the Southern Gulf Islands, which is on the very southern end of Vancouver Island, which sticks down. And it's actually like Victoria is due, which is actually south of Bellingham. And Salt Spring Island, where we work, is due west of Bellingham. And there's a number of features in that area. The oldest ethnographic evidence of clam gardens comes from the state of Washington. And they're found all through southern BC, the central coast of British Columbia, up into southeast Alaska, I think the furthest northern one that's been recorded is in Sitka, Alaska, although there's some in Cake as well. And likely further north, they just haven't been publicly identified or recorded yet. It's one of those things that the more that we look and the more that people know what to look for, the more of these features we're finding. And so It's a really interesting technology that spans, thousands of miles of coastline, many different language families, and many different tribal communities. And these clam gardens or sea gardens, we can look at and try to understand from a variety of different perspectives. I'm a marine ecologist by training, and so I think about what are the ecological mechanisms at play when clam gardens are built and maintained. And so not testing the practices, but understanding the mechanisms behind those practices. We can also think about how sea garden tending is revitalizing intergenerational knowledge sharing, youth and elders out on the beach talking about how do you care for beaches, how do you care for clams, what's the protocol around when to harvest and when not to harvest, and what to harvest, how to dig, how to fill holes, things like that. And we've seen a lot of resurgence around identity as well. And so I think in the marine environment, one thing that's been really prevalent for a long time in kind of the dominant narrative is that Native people didn't have an impact on the marine ecosystem, that the ocean's so big and so vast that there's no way that Indigenous people could impact it, or have a need for any form of management. And clam gardens offer this very big, tangible example. Many of these clam gardens have more rock in them than Stonehenge. Some of them are kilometer long. I always mix my values. Kilometer long and maybe 6 to 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, like massive amounts of rock. And being able to reclaim and reinvigorate that presence and rights and title has been really important for people to show this is our ancestral practice. This is something that our people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, and bringing that back as part of our inherent rights. To support this work, we are part of a Clam Garden Network, and this is a loose affiliation of about 9 of us that have been working together, many of us for well over a decade, on clam garden restoration. And so it's a mix of community members, ecologists, social scientists, archaeologists, trying to support community sharing around how restoration's done, best practices, guidelines around how to find and how to restore clam gardens. And we host webinars, and we're growing into an organization that can help span that boundary, and working with communities and agencies are working with communities on pathways for restoration. We do a lot of sort of pro bono consultation, looking at images, doing surveys, helping communities look in their territory for these features, providing advice kind of free of charge and confidentially. And we're working to formalize this network into a formal organization. We've been an informal organization since 2012, so going on 13 years now. And we're working through the process of becoming a formal, what will look like a charitable trust in Canada under the Make Way Shared platform. Very similar to being fiscally sponsored by a nonprofit in the US, but due to the distribution of clam gardens and the way that foundation funding travels, we decided it's better to be in Canada. We're working through that process of how do you formalize and still kind of keep the organic magic that we've had for the past decade. And right now we know we're learning more every day about clam gardens, but you can say what we know right now is that in these clam gardens, and so I talked about terracing the beach to creating more habitat. So if you just did that alone, if you, in many areas, double the amount of habitat, in some areas, 35% of the shoreline is actually clam gardens. So 35% of the shoreline is actually modified into clam gardens, which for each clam garden effectively doubles the amount of area. You've already increased the amount of harvestable biomass. And so I think about it as if you had a raised garden bed in your backyard and you're growing carrots and you've got one raised garden bed, and then you double it to 2 raised garden beds, you're going to have twice as many carrots now, right? Because you've got twice as much area. But what also happens is within a clam garden compared to a non-clam garden is about 2 to 4 times the biomass and twice the growth rate. So to think about it as going from 1 carrot garden bed, raised garden bed to 2, but then with each raised bed, carrots are growing twice as fast, and there's more carrots per unit area. That's really what we see with clam gardens, is that it's increasing the amount of clams through a bunch of different mechanisms. We have no idea, like how many are out there. The 10% that are identified, that's just a wild guess. Honestly, the more time we spend looking, the more that we find. And often these features are pretty nuanced, and so it takes a lot of work to positively identify one. And that's something we're working on this summer, is thinking through the quantitative mechanisms to identify clam gardens based on elevation and profile and rugosity. And the ones that have been identified, many have yet to be reactivated. And so these are features that have been maintained for thousands of years with a pause in the past few years. And there's a lot of barriers to reactivation. And that's one thing that the Clam Garden Network is trying to reduce those barriers. We've really only dated maybe 13 is the kind of latest number I've heard, clam gardens, and their dates range between 1,500 and 4,000 years before present. Now, with that said, we're also in the area where we have had a lot of sea level rise. And so it's pretty common to see your oldest dates around 4,000 years before present, because before that, sea level was rising pretty rapidly. And we see a lot of features where you can stand on the beach, stand on a clam garden rock wall and look into the water and see another wall, and below that another wall. And so that is an indication that these features have been adapting to sea level rise through time. In other areas in Quadra Island, kind of halfway up Vancouver Island, between Vancouver Island and mainland BC, sea level has actually been dropping relative sea level because isostatic rebound, the land has been rising faster. And so that gives us a really cool opportunity to look at the oldest features are now high up on the beach, and the newer features, by oldest, I mean 4,000, newer 1,500, are now at modern sea level. And so there's a very clear indication of the old one is now way up on the beach, the newer one's down lower towards modern sea level. When they are community partners that often talk about is that these are about a lot more than just clams, and so even more than food systems. But in the food system space, the rock wall is also home to at least 21 different traditional foods, things like red rock crab, red sea cucumber, octopus, chitons, large limpets, snails, seaweeds. So it's also a really diverse food system. One way I describe that is, if you think about, if we're down the Caribbean, and I'm like, hey, let's go for a dive. I've got 2 spots we can go to. One is 30 feet deep, and it's all just sand bottom, and the other one's 30 feet deep, and it's a coral reef. Which one do you want to go to? Most people want to go to the coral reef because you're going to see more stuff, right? And partially, you're going to see more stuff because coral provides a 3-dimensional habitat. When you have a 3-dimensional habitat, 3-dimensional structure, it generally increases biomass and biodiversity. There's places for things to hide and live in. We see the same thing with this rocky reef, effectively built at the bottom of a clam garden, that it's really porous. There's lots of holes for things to hide and live in. Some really cool work out of Simon Fraser University. Emily Shaver is the grad student, and Ann Solomon's the primary advisor, looked at following the 2021 heat dome we had in the Northwest. The estimates were it killed billions of animals in the intertidal. So that heat dome, where we had triple-digit temperatures for the Northwest, happened during the lowest tides of the year. So you have animals that normally live in like 55-degree seawater, now exposed to triple-digit air temperatures. The rocks they live on heat up beyond that, just created mass mortality. And we saw that on a lot of beaches by dead clamshells coming up to the surface. And community members noted, well, that happened, but less on clam gardens compared to other areas. So Emily and Anne went out to recreate a heat dome using actually propane heaters, and found that the beach sediment, the clam garden sediment, actually reduced the temperature impact. And so in clam gardens, there's less warming at clam depth. And as I mentioned, so there's some indication that these could mitigate against extreme climate events. And as I mentioned, they've been used for thousands of years to adapt to sea level rise. In my lab, we spent some time looking at the mechanisms for increased growth rate. And so one of the thoughts is that because of the physical oceanography and the benthic substrate in clam gardens, clams are probably feeding on different things. And so we did a diet study using stable isotopes and fatty acids, which is fatty acids are just, you are what you eat. And so we get our fatty acids from food. And that's a way of tracking what clams are eating. And the study, we found that the big difference was actually salinity driven. And so in clam garden areas, salinity was higher. It's more kind of our ocean salinity compared to some of the non-clam garden areas that tended to have freshwater input that impacts the feeding window for clams, the types of things that they can eat. And so we found that more of the places that clam gardens were built are better spots for clams to grow. So it's a bit of like it's an interesting study to think about. People put effort into building a clam garden in spots that were already good for clams, which is another way of thinking about the result. And I had a student work on the traditional ecological knowledge around red tides. And one of the red tides that we get here is called paralogic shellfish poisoning, which is caused by alexandrium, which is a dinoflagellate, which creates saxitoxin, which is a deadly neurotoxin, prevents your nerves from working. And what Jacqueline did, joint with Northwest Indian College, was collect clams every 2 weeks in Bellingham, while Northwest Indian College was also doing phytoplankton tows, so they could quantify what species are in the water, and they were doing biotoxin testing in the water, so we had an idea of how much saxitoxin's in the water. So she would collect clams every 2 weeks, and then one of our traditional teachings is on a clam, they have a neck or a siphon. In butter clams, the tip of the neck or the siphon is black. And a lot of people call it the nose. But a lot of people remove that part of the clam and discard it. And that teaching is often cited as that's where the toxins are held. And so discarding that is a way of reducing toxic exposure. Some communities remove the entire neck as well. And so we collect these clams. We know the amount of toxins in the water, the amount of phytoplankton that create the toxins in the water. And then we would break them up into 5 different parts and measure the saxitoxin concentration in each part of the body. And we also have the mass. And so then we can kind of build a little equation where we'd say, if we eat this but not that, what's our average saxitoxin exposure? Is the regulatory limits based on amount of toxin per weight of shellfish. And found that disproportionately the siphon had about 450, about 4.5 times more toxin per unit mass compared to the rest of the clam, and the siphon is about the same, about 4 times more toxin per unit mass. So by removing the siphon and siphon tip, you're discarding about 16% of the toxin, but you're discarding about 50, a bit more than that, that was 60, yeah, 60% of the toxins. So if you're running the equation of like, okay, we're in the math of I've spent all this effort, collected all this biomass, all these clams. If I'm throwing the siphon and siphon tip away, I'm giving up 16% of the available protein, but discarding 60% of the available toxin. It's a pretty interesting result. In some communities, in the Central Coast of British Columbia are working with federal managers to monitor clams for biotoxins, both the whole clam and the clam minus the siphon. And so they'll have times when it's safe to harvest clams if the siphon is discarded, which is not something we do in the state of Washington right now, but we do monitor biotoxins quite well. We're seeing a lot of interest, and this is actually a really growing conversation we're having, is what is the role of clam garden rock walls in changing both ocean conditions, sea level rise, and storminess. There's a lot of concern of losing clam beds as sea level rises, but there's also an increased amount of coastal erosion. So as the winter waves hit the beach, they're washing away the nearshore environment, which is land, but it's also in many places archaeological sites. And so there's a lot of community interest in building clam gardens, building modern day new clam gardens as a way of mitigating or adapting to climate change. The Samish Indian tribal community just south of me in Le Connor area built the first clam garden in the modern era in, I think it was 2022. That they first moved rocks, and so I was part of the advisory team on this. But it was a 7-year process of doing site surveys, community surveys, and deciding, is this something we want to do and where do we want to do it? Now that it's been built, we're able to look at questions like how fast is the sediment filling in behind it? How is it changing clam populations? And then with another lab here at Western, we're trying to understand the oceanography over the clam garden. How does that rock wall, does it absorb the wave energy and reduce the amount of waves that crash on the near shore? Is it creating a pool of warm water that's increasing phytoplankton productivity? Is it increasing the residence time of that water, meaning is the water slowing down and more phytoplankton and larvae are falling into the benthos? So we've got 2 grad students and another faculty working on this. And we're trying to build out a network of other folks working on basically physical oceanography of clam gardens. As concerns around climate change, but also one of the other big impacts we have that I think is understudied is the impact of boat wakes. And so the ocean is noisier and busier than it was before. Some of these clam gardens, like the ones in the Southern Gulf, are in the same bay that has a ferry. So multiple times a day, a ferry is going by, kicking up a big wake. Same thing with private boaters. All of these waves are hitting the beach and causing erosion. How does that interact with the clam garden rock wall? And then we're working on a project now to try to develop tools for clam garden identification in the San Juan Islands based on things we've seen in the Southern Gulf Islands. So there's a distribution of clam gardens all up and down the coast, and they look a lot different depending where you're at. Where we're at in the state of Washington and the Southern Gulf Islands, one of our big struggles is that we've had more sea level rise compared to other areas. And the features just look a bit different. It's more of a gradual line wall of rocks as opposed to a straight vertical wall of rocks like we see in Quadra, Celtic territory, other areas. And so the search image that people have is a bit different. And so trying to develop tools and technologies on identification, and we're working with tribal historic preservation offices from a number of communities, both offering our services to look for features or look at images they have and guidance on that, and then trying to develop tools and technologies to be able to increase the identification of features. And we do a lot of this using a boundary spanner model. And the boundary spanner model actually a lot of the ideas came out of the clam garden work and others. And effectively, the nexus was, if you think about a project that you really love, that's like really impactful, where community members and scientists are working together, and everybody sees value in the project, and everybody's excited about the project. And you think about, well, what's the glue that's holding all that together? Like, how did that come to be, and how is that relationship maintained? And it's frequently through a boundary spanner, an individual that's able to understand community needs, ways of communication, language, verbal, nonverbal communication, and also understand the processes of mainstream science and the language there. Sometimes it's an individual from that community, or sometimes it's an individual that's been working with that community for a long time. And boundary spanner has been used at the organizational level. Land grant institutions, for example, are meant to be boundary spanning organizations through cooperative extension programs and others. But we were really interested at the individual level, meaning that I think that institutional goals are implemented by people, and it's the people on the ground that are actually doing that work. Part of our boundary spanner conversation was a lot of the people that had the biggest impact on the project and the biggest impact on project success were often not individuals with high rank within the organizational structure. And so part of the goal was to highlight and elevate that functionality to get it the attention and accolades it deserves. So it can be an individual, a small team of individuals, often a community member or a trusted ally, somebody that's worked with that community in some cases 2+ decades, and they're acting as the fulcrum of partnership. In particular, they're from the beginning figuring out what everybody needs to feel honored and valued in that partnership. And we've also talked a bit about the equitable exchange, which is another model. I don't like the word currency, but that's what we wound up with, where it's a way of thinking about what's of value in academic spaces with the currency in academic spaces, papers, grad students, things like that. But what's the community currencies? And what we were seeing a lot of is if community currencies were paid, it was often assigned by the academics, meaning, oh, I heard you guys like this, so we're going to put, a small amount of money in for X, Y, or Z, versus having that conversation early through a boundary spanner of what's important from your perspective to engage in this project. Because often you hear from the academic side, well, it's good for them, they should want to participate. You're like, well, you're assigning that currency to somebody else. And so having that conversation about what's important to those communities, it's going to be different everywhere. It could be K-12 involvement, it could be hearing local artists, it could be, data management, ownership, power over telling their own story, it could be a lot of things. And so having those conversations well before there's a grant deadline to understand, if we work together, here's what we're going to, what we expect out of that. And we've taken those models and we're now applying them to Aspire. And I should have updated this, but if we changed our website, now it's Aspire Science or Aspire something. ecologist.org will still work. But we have two different opportunities to that. One is a webinar series that we're doing a 7-part webinar series on community partnerships. We just finished the second one yesterday, but that's an open invite for everybody to attend. And then the other thing that we're doing is working with the topics for the webinar series. That QR code might be out of date. I don't recall. And then the second one we're doing, which I need a lot of applications for, is a immersive institute. And so that is working with a small group of early career scholars, postdoc through pre-tenure faculty on a 1-week immersive experience. In this case, we'll be working with the Duwamish River Community Coalition in South Seattle, people that effectively live in a Superfund site, mixed heavy industrial and housing, and concerns around air and water quality. And they've been working with University of Washington and Western Washington University faculty for joint research projects for a long time. And so we're going to spend a week with those researchers and with that community to understand sort of the nuts and bolts of how those relationships were formed and how they've been maintained. And I've got, I can pull it up when we're done talking, but that application is live and due on March 15th. And so I should have included it. I apologize. But if you go to Aspire or Echo Exchange, you should be able to find it. Native Fuse, you guys know about that. Another project we have is CBIC Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges and Science. This is an NSF-funded project. It's a network of hubs around the U.S. and in the world with partners in Aotearoa and Australia, fair amount of Canadian partnership. I co-lead the Pacific Northwest Hub, but we're building out community-based partnerships on science, where we're braiding traditional knowledge and Western science, and braiding pathways for students, postdocs, and faculty. When we look at barriers, this is a project I was tangentially involved in. I was part of the committee, but I didn't do any of the day-to-day work. Where we're looking at barriers to coastal tribes and climate adaptation. And this is a pretty cool one because we did a bunch of listening sessions for tribal leaders, people in that space of what's that barrier to accessing funding. And I think we all know them, particularly for the, across the range of communities. Many are remote with lower amounts of resources around staffing, bandwidth, owners reporting, match, all these things. But this actually codified all of that. So I think that's actually really powerful to have it written down in a document that can be shared. And so that's up now. It's specific to coastal tribes in Washington and Oregon, although I would argue that it's applicable nationally. So that's a cool project. And then just thinking quickly about some of the common barriers to community partnerships with academia. We talked about the mismatch of currencies that mainstream institutions can feel that the majority of the currencies need to remain at that mainstream institution, and or they're just the wrong ones. And so by having that echo exchange conversation first, it really helps. I think we've all been on different sides of the short timeline problem of this request for proposals just came out, or I just heard about it and I need, we want a letter of support in a week. Depending on the project and who I'm working with, if we don't have a prior relationship, right, we're not even going to broach that conversation. But if it's something we've been working on together, we've predetermined, hey, we want to work on camas restoration on rocky bald habitats on St. Clair Island, and this funding comes up, we can apply there. And then, we can work through short timelines a lot easier because we've invested in that relationship first. Another common barrier that we see is what a friend of mine calls the cover page, which is like the splash page of your website. Like the desire for universities to publicize partnerships without having a clear working agreement first, that can jeopardize those relationships. And so in the partnerships we have, we won't publicize those until we've gotten to the point where we're comfortable of having a working agreement of how do we want to share this information? How do we want to codify? What is your role? What is my role? What language do we use when we talk about this partnership? Your university press office would be happy to write it up in their language with images that they use, but having that done between you and the community first is really important. Budget categories are always an issue of how we fund stipends, paperwork required to that, cultural gifts, things like that. And that takes a lot of kind of creative solutions on the other side, whether it be working with match, working with indirect return, whatever that might be. But it takes On the academic side, we get the no almost immediately, and so it's on the kind of boundary spanner to figure out how to work through that. Another big one is administrative overhead, and so a lot of communities we work with, unless there's a certain dollar value on the partnership, it's just not worth it because there's so much administrative overhead required that it really has to be a substantial project to have that engagement. And then we are trying to, through the Aspire project, do a lot of that, as much administrative overhead as we can. So for all of our subawards and contracts, we have a conversation, we write up, summarize that conversation, and then have folks read through it and like rewrite it again. So instead of just saying, do all this paperwork, we take as much burden as we can off the community. And the last one, I'll probably I'll go 2 more minutes real quick, is there's often a desire to use these kind of projects as a pipeline to your home institution. And my response has been to clean your house first. And so if you look at the retention for Native American students at my university, it's the lowest of any group based on or the graduation rate's the lowest based for any group, and retention's quite low as well. And so, before we focus on bringing in more Indigenous students to Western, I first want to ask the question of, well, why are we failing the students we have now, right? Like what's going on? What can we do to help the students we have now? Let's focus on that before we start trying to recruit a bunch more. And that my theory of change is the new popular word, has been for a long time that it's place-based research is the primary retention, recruitment, joy tool that Indigenous students engage Indigenous students in science. And so when I was at Northwest Indian College, we had students from 120 different tribal nations, many and including BC and Canada, many from the Southwest. And so you have a lot of people from the Southwest that are now in the Northwest working on clams. I don't want to speak for those of you from the Southwest, but my assumption is clam digging is not part of your culture. But they're up here doing that project because it's of importance to our tribal partners and its importance of the place that they're at now. And so they're guests, and they want to use their skills to help and work on these projects. Now, that exact tool of how to do this clam study, is it relevant back home? Probably not. But the mechanism, the way that the work is done is. And so engagement in place-based research that's important to communities is, to me, kind of vital to that. I also believe that centers are quite powerful, and that's something that we've been talking around in the background, including IRES. So having these centers dedicated to both students on campus, but also the partnership between the university and external communities. We're building a longhouse, so bright lights at Western, and I really like, if you have not seen, I encourage you to go to the Right Relations Collaborative. It's run by Jess Housty, who's Heltzik, and it flips the script on private donors and philanthropic organizations and the way that they operate. And so looking at that Right Relations Collaborative and the way that they've been able to structure and change the power dynamic, to me is a really cool, bright light. So with that, Aishka, thank you, and got some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hatch. It was a pleasure and to learn from you today, and really learned a lot in a short time. Appreciate your cookie story analogy, learning about sea gardens, the importance of boundary spanners, and really like how you discussed that idea of challenging that narrative of Indigenous people not having influence over marine ecosystems. I think it's a very important talk, and we appreciate your presence tremendously. But now, yes, we'll open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask, and we will try to make sure that questions in the Zoom, those who are there in the in-person audience get to hear them as well. Dr. Chief.
Thank you, Dr. Hatch, for an amazing talk. I learned so much through your presentation and really appreciate all the work that you're doing and your leadership in this area. It's a real inspiration for me and many of the students here. My question was related to your integration of science and social sciences and how you went about doing that in terms of ensuring that you are being abiding by ethics and also just considering the tribal research protections and how you make sure that when you're collaborating that your collaborator is doing that appropriately. And I just love how, you have all those graphs indicating the different growth rates, but then how you said you also make sure you talk to the community, you survey, and so that your science is really useful to the community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It depends on, I mean, kind of depends on the project, but we do have on the more physical projects like the oceanography. There's a data management agreement where the community owns all of the data, and so we've got clear guidance on that, and we go through a process for any result sharing and publication and presentations. And then depending on, it's hard because I work in Washington, DC, and Alaska, and they're all different systems. And then depending on the project, if it is interview based, then we'll go through IRB processes, both at Western, but also Northwest Indian College, which has a tribal IRB. So that's a second layer. And then other projects might be more consultative, so working with tribal historic preservation offices around conversations around what is useful, and trainings around how to look and identify features, and then from there more one-on-one agreements for if things are found, what happens to that information. And so because we're in a bunch of different spaces, I don't really have a universal answer. And so that's the way we've been operating. So it depends on the project and what's involved. I think a couple of our tribal partners have really good data management and data ownership agreements. And on the university side, they've been better about accepting those. 8 years ago, it was a pretty big barrier. One thing they've added recently, which I actually agree with, is codifying the process. If we get a Freedom of Information Act request, what's the process from there? Because we're state employees, and so we can make a promise, but the public employees, we might not be able to deliver on that, meaning that the data might not actually be as protected as we hold the community it is. And so having codifying the FOIA process and when the tribe would have to intervene has been useful too. Anybody want to talk about cookies?
I have a question for you in relation to boundary spanners. So when those who are conducting and facilitating research are from the community in which they're doing the research, or they've immersed themselves in the community, and they also have an inherent skill of kind of making the research accessible to community, is there still a need to have a boundary spanner in place, or do you just consider the researcher that person?
I would, yeah. So somebody actually wrote a paper. Are we all boundary spanners now? So that's the negative about the term is you can just like over apply it. So I would say, so if you're a member of the community, you're doing work with your community, are you reliant or engaging external people? Member, are you doing it for your degree or your employment? So you're engaging that institution. And then what my assumption is you'd experience, like if you're doing, graduate work with your community, you're going to start to get requests from other people to also engage with your home community. And so you're going to be seen as an entry point to working with that community. And that's where a lot of the boundary spanning stuff comes in. That's kind of more detailed in the paper around having community protection as your highest calling and protection against inequitable projects. And so whether you just doing your project by yourself, maybe not, but you'll be seen as a boundary spanner to outsiders, and you're going to start to get a bunch of requests. Is my assumption, because that matches your experience. But...
Thank you.
What's your favorite kind of cookie?
Well, so tell me about what did the cookie represent in that story? How do you say your name? I'm sorry.
My name's Devetny.
Devetny, okay.
To me, the cookie is not what you wanted, and is whatever this fancy little scientist dreamed up to help their own damn career, and they just wanted a nice little native, apologies for the swears, and they just wanted a nice little indigenous coating on top of it, whereas we wanted something our people could actually eat.
Yeah, I think that's a good interpretation. And then so another way I think about that too is, so when you constrain indigenous partnership to decoration, then if that we're not done, if both groups showed up with ingredients, figured out what to do, the product would have been something that neither of them could have done on their own, right? It would have been something fundamentally different. And so when we're thinking about discovery space, that opens up a whole new discovery space, right? But instead, what happened is we have the same project, but now, like you said, like with a native drawing on the front. I'll tell a really quick story. I worked with a Dungati man about a year ago, Mitch Gibbs from Australia, and he came up to learn about some of the clam garden work we're doing, and he does oyster reef restoration back home. And the government's really big on doing these oyster reef restorations. And so the government came in this community and they said, we're going to restore this oyster reef for you, and we're going to do it over here. And the community said, well, there's never been an oyster reef there. It doesn't work. You need to do it over here. Government said, well, we're the government. We know best. We're going to do it over here. So they put it in the wrong spot for the community. And then they came back to the community and they said, hey, we built your oyster reef. Do you want to give it a traditional name? And so they thought about it and they gave them a name, and the government scientists, ran off all happy. And now they've got like a traditional name for this oyster reef. And Mitch turns to the guy and says, hey, what does that mean? And the guy says, stupid effing pile of rocks, which I just thought was kind of funny. So.
We'll just give it a moment to see if we get any other questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to step up and ask something. Okay, so if that's
Carlotta. My question is a cultural spanner similar to a cultural broker?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that term. What's the definition of a cultural broker?
I think it's I don't know the exact definition, but it's used in education for teachers that are able to ensure that culture is considered in the classroom. And I don't know if I don't like, I mean, I don't know if I like that term really, like cultural broker sounds very transactional. But I just thought maybe if you had any thoughts on that, because with indigenizing food, energy, water curriculum, that's kind of something that we've come across and sounds somewhat similar to cross boundary spanners.
Yeah, I just looked up really quickly. Yeah, cultural brokers, looks like it started in the healthcare literature in the 60s. Yeah, boundary spanner actually started, the earliest uses of the term I found was in the 70s in the business literature. And so I think there's a lot of similarities between the two. They might just come out of different literatures. And so the one thing that we liked about, or one of the reasons we used the term boundary spanner, A, I didn't know what cultural brokers were, but B, some of the literature around boundary spanners is from engineering firms where they have really clear metrics of how people are measured and evaluated. And so if you're in a silo in engineering, you can be really productive. Or if you're an engineering group and you're a boundary spanner, you're working across two different types of engineering, you'll be less productive by the traditional metrics, but you'll have a higher degree of innovation. And so we were trying to come up with a term or utilize a term that increase the badge or the significance or the value or the awareness of that as a function within the organization. And we felt that often early career folks might be faced with that reality of or perception of doing community-based work takes a lot of time, and the work might take longer in process compared to if I just stayed in my silo and just did research and not worked with communities. I could have a higher productivity based on the standard university metrics of number of papers. And then in the boundary spanner world, maybe that productivity on that standard matrix is less number of papers, but the innovation of the different ways of doing work is higher. So I think it was one of the things that drew us to the boundary spanner term.
Thank you.
Yes, Carlson, if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you. Sorry for dropping out there. My internet went all array. I did have a question about, it seems you've helped with a lot of graduate students, masters, and PhD, I presume, navigate, oh my God, sorry. Navigate doing this, learning from traditional ecological knowledge, working with tribal communities. And I was just curious in doing that work, because as you've made it very clear, this is all very relationship building. You need to have those connections. You need to find those community experts. And I'm curious, is it a case of you kind of like let the students use relationships that they already have with their own communities? Or are these relationships that you've started years ago and are like kind of introducing the students to? I'm very much pulling from my own experience of just random like student just kind of popping into existence is a lot of labor for a student to take on, trying to connect with a whole community by themselves.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, that question, because that's the common question I will get a common question from like a master's student: how do I develop community-based partnerships? And on the student on their own, I generally don't encourage that. And so to answer your question more directly, yeah, 100%. If you're working with your own community, and I've got students that are doing that, we still have to go through the university processes, and the community processes, IRB, data management, having, and one of the projects, it's kind of cool. We have the official, IRB, tribal IRB, but then there's also somebody involved in the project as sort of the cultural leader as well. We've got to me, like the cultural overseeing, and then like the government, rules overseeing. But for a student that just walked into my lab, yeah, I wouldn't say go build a relationship with over here, for a few reasons. One is the timeline, but there's also, you have to think about whatever happens in that relationship. At the end of the day, there's two kind of big names that are left on that partnership. One is my university's name, and the other one's my name. And so we have to be able to follow back and close out the project, and present and make sure we end that project in a good way. Often students will have that intention, but then 3 weeks before they go to defend, they get a job on the other side of the country. It makes sense. You got to go. And so like that closing the loop stuff and the maintenance of that relationship is, to me, on my shoulders. And so if there's, and I've had some folks that were non-native, maybe like worked with a tribe in the natural resource department, and there's a project that we want to do, like things like that, like it would make sense. There are also communities I have working relationships with as well. But at the end of the day, it's your university's reputation and your reputation that are out there. And so you have to maintain those.
Man, thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Hatch, for sharing everything with us today, your insights, your experiences. We appreciate your time and all the knowledge that you've taken the time to share with us. A big thank you as well to everyone who joined us, and to our co-sponsors, the Indigenous Resilience Center, the UA Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, and the Office of Societal Impact for making this seminar possible. So again, we want to invite everybody to join us for our next talk in the Spring 2025 Native Voices in STEM seminar series, which will take place on March 19th and feature Dr. Joseph Brewer. So before we officially close, we encourage students who would like to stay online for a more informal Q&A to do so. It's a really great opportunity to ask additional questions, seek mentorship, or engage in discussion with Dr. Hatch, with the speaker, in a kind of like a smaller and more student-focused setting. And again, we thank everybody for being here today and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.